Many thanks, Victoria, for the introduction, and I'm very grateful for the invitation by the Jewish Studies program here at UVA to talk about these issues and my biography of Martin Niemöller. I'm painfully aware that my talk today and the book more generally is not at all in any way a meaningful contribution to the understanding of Jewish life and Jewish culture in Germany in the 20th century. But then I would hope that it contributes something to an understanding of one of the factors that most affected Jewish life in Germany in the 20th century, which is anti-Semitism and the persecution of the Jews and the Jewish community, not only in Germany, but across Europe. So visitors to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., they come across a room which has a quote emblazoned on the wall. I think it's at the end of the exhibition. Thank you. I haven't been there for many, many years. And in the caption, they are informed that it originates from Martin Niemöller, a Lutheran minister who was imprisoned for his opposition to the Nazi regime. And the quote goes as follows. You might have seen the quote before. So first, in the rendering, this rendering, other renderings of the quote do exist. First, they came for the socialists. I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists. Then they came for the Jews. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. Who was Martin Niemöller? And why did he confess his remorse about speaking out too late on behalf of the victims of the Nazi regime? And why is this quote used today, not only in Holocaust education, but also in political discourse, especially in the US, I would say? And most crucially, why did Niemöller not speak out on behalf of the Jews in 1933, when the Nazis seized power in Germany and unleashed a campaign of violence and legal repression against the Jewish community? In the following, I will try to answer these questions. I will focus on Niemöller's attitudes towards Jews and Judaism, and how he articulated German guilt vis-à-vis the Holocaust in the post-war period. I focus on one individual. However, the wider significance of Niemöller as a case study should be clear. By the late 1930s, 2/3 of all Germans were Protestants, and how Protestants responded to the persecution of the Jews during the Third Reich is thus indicative of a wider set of attitudes in the German population. Niemöller was born in 1892 as the oldest son of a Lutheran pastor. Like many sons of the educated middle class around that time, he signed up for a career as an officer in the Imperial Navy. Joining in 1910, he thus became a member of the Crew 1910 of Navy cadets. The German Navy used the British terminology, so they used in German the term Crew 1910. The Crew 1910, which among other people also included Karl Dönitz, seen here on the right, rather frail shortly before his death in 1980, who succeeded in April 1945 for a brief period Adolf Hitler as German Chancellor and who was head of the German Navy Command during the Second World War. During the First World War, Niemöller entered service in the U-boat fleet. I should maybe add briefly, but we can come back to this. So this was a meeting of the crew members. They were not any longer serving in the crew, more after the First World War and then especially after 1945. So the crew became a community, not of service, but of memory. And Niemöller then took part in these meetings again from the late 1960s onwards. So Niemöller, during the war, he signed up to the U-boat fleet, assuming command of his own submarine in 1918. He left the Navy in early 1919, dismayed by the November Revolution, which toppled the imperial power structures, forced the German Emperor Wilhelm II into exile, and by the abdication of the Kaiser. And in this context of defeat and revolution, he wrote his very first, I want to emphasize, anti-Semitic statement in a letter to his parents. So we have no prior indication that he harbored any anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic feelings. I don't read the quote out here, but you can see sort of how he's using the metaphor of the witches' Sabbath that's emerging on the ruins of German national honor and greatness that have been destroyed. And the emperor that's a statement of a matter of fact, had to leave the country. And he thinks, because I'm dead sure that otherwise his people would have betrayed him. And then follows this rant, German women, exclamation mark, Elise Salomon signs in their name, these goddamn Jews, end of quote. Elise Salomon, for context, was a pioneer of social work in Germany, but had been baptized as a Protestant in 1914. In a newspaper article in December 1918, she discussed the positive consequences of the introduction of female suffrage for the election to the National Assembly in early January 1919. So Niemöller's rant against her in particular thus combined racial antisemitism, it was widely known that she was a baptized Protestant, and anti-feminism condensed in this metaphor of the witches' Sabbath. After some contemplation, Niemöller opted for a career as a Protestant pastor, which promised a secure livelihood. He enrolled as a student of Protestant theology in Münster in late 1919, but until 1922, when he finally started to focus on his exams, he was actually a part-time student at best. Because he was enrolled, his radical nationalist activism consumed most of his time. From 1919 to 1992, Niemöller was either active or a registered member of no fewer than 8 radical nationalist folkish associations, parties and organizations, all of which championed in one form or another racial antisemitism. He was an active member in the student group of the German National People's Party, the DNVP, and the German Völkisch Protection and Defiance Federation, respectively. He was member of the National Association of German Officers, which is not listed here on the slide, I apologize, and where also anti-Semitic agitation was the order of the day. He also then attended, was not a member, but attended meetings and events of the League of the Upright, which was a monarchist organization which was striving to restore the monarchy in Germany, the Pan-German League, which is the clearing agency of German right-wing radicalism from the 1890s, and 2 paramilitary organizations. His entry in the student group of the German Völkisch Protection and Defiance Federation is of particular importance because this was the first fascist mass organization in post-war Germany, before it was disbanded in 1921. And aggressive racial antisemitism was the core of its ideology. Everybody who joined this group had to affirm in writing, to the best of his knowledge and belief, that, I quote here again, he is of German descent and that his or his wife's ancestors in particular are not of Jewish blood, end of quote. So he essentially signed a declaration that he was of what in Völkisch parlance was called of Aryan descent, according to Völkisch racist ideology. His entry into this particular group is of significance because at this point there could have been no other reason for him to join this group than to further emphasize his focus on racial antisemitism, because all the other groups in which he was active at the time, they already, supported anti-Semitic agendas. The DVSTB, the sole purpose of this group was spouting racial antisemitism. Millions of leaflets, stickers, pamphlets, etc. were distributed by this organization. Niemöller then worked from 1924 to 1931 as managing director for the Inner Mission in Westphalia, sort of a internal missionary organization, before he took up the position as third pastor in the affluent parish of Berlin, of the Berlin suburb of Dahlem in 1931. And here he was thrust into the limelight of the so-called church struggle, which erupted in 1933. Essentially, this was a conflict over control of the Protestant Church of the Old Prussian Union. It's a very complicated title. The acronym, I might use the acronym, is APU. It's Old Prussian because it did not include some of the territories that Prussia had seized in 1866. And this church brought together Lutheran and Reformed Christians under one administrative roof, but not following a joint sort of coherent confessional outlook. On one side of this conflict were the so-called German Christians, a group founded by Protestant clergy in Berlin in early 1932, who were all devoted supporters of and members of the Nazi Party. The German Christians viewed the gospel through the lens of Völkisch ideology and aimed to purge the Old Testament and the Jewish roots of Christ from the promulgation of faith. They fought against Marxism, against secularist freethinkers and the Jews, much in line with Nazi theology. And they wanted to implement the Führer principle in the Protestant churches. From the get-go, these German Christians became a powerful force in Prussian and, by implication, German church politics. In November 1932, so before Hitler was appointed Chancellor, there were Synod elections and they gathered around about a third of the votes across Prussia. Then in July 1933, so after Hitler had been appointed as Chancellor and the Nazis seized power, the German Christians won a two-thirds majority in the General Synod of the Prussian Church. At the end of September 1933, Ludwig Müller, a German Christian Nazi Party member, actually a former Navy chaplain, so also a member of the Imperial Navy, became the highest Protestant dignitary in Germany as the Reich Bishop. And on 5th of September 1933, the Old Prussian Synod, led by the large majority of its German Christian members, introduced the Aryan paragraph for civil servants, which had been introduced by the state for civil servants, so state employees. Now they introduced it on their own volition to church offices, which meant that Protestant pastors of Jewish descent were barred from the ministry, from holding office. Niemöller and some like-minded friends responded by founding the Pastor Emergency League in late September 1933. And the emergency to which the name referred was the offense against the status questionis, so of the key confessional principle that the introduction of the Aryan paragraph entailed. All baptized Christians were equal to God, and hence discriminating against some of them offended a key principle of the church in the view of Niemöller and his friends. Every pastor who wanted to join the Emergency League had to sign a declaration of commitment. The 4 points of this pledge are here on the slide. So the alignment with Holy Scripture and the confessions of the Reformation, that is the 16th century documents that underpinned Lutheran thinking and Reform thinking about the right practice of the faith, protesting against all violations of this confessional state, i.e. sort of the dogmas that are prescribed and circumscribed by these confessional documents, a responsibility to those who are persecuted because of such insistence on the confessional state, and then the fourth point, specifying that the application of the Aryan paragraph is such a violation of this confessional understanding of the principles of the Protestant Church. These 4 articles of the pledge were a unit, but they emphasized different aspects. At any rate, the Pastor Emergency League made active engagement for Jewish Christians, that's the contemporary term for Christians of Jewish descent, among pastors the prime reason for gathering oppositional forces in the church. Even though only a small minority, around about 180 out of 18,000 Protestant pastors, were actually affected by this measure. So for Niemöller, this commitment to support these pastors of Jewish descent led him to gather opposition, but it was none other than Niemöller himself who then publicly broke up the unity of the 4 articles of this pledge as early as November 1933, in a way already then again distancing himself from the document that he had written only a few weeks before. He published a short text in November on sentences entitled Sentences on the Aryan Question in the Church, which reiterated, first of all, this idea that the application, or the key point that the application of the Aryan paragraph violated a fundamental confessional issue. However, then the argument went in another direction, and in a letter to Pastor Gottfried Holz from October 1933, Niemöller had already anticipated some of the argument that he then later published in November. And here Niemöller expressed himself much more openly. And I quote, I quote here, the comparison with the Black Africans and other mission churches. For Black Africans, he actually used the N-word, the racist N-word to be sure. He wrote here, was not valid, as, and I quote again, the Christian Jew loses his core ethnic characteristics. The German term is Volkstumszugehörigkeit. Volkstum is a term that can take on a variety of meanings, but in this context, it has clearly racial and racist connotations. So the idea that the German people are based and grounded in a joint ethnic kind of community that is defined by racial terms. So sorry for the explanation. So the Christian Jew, he wrote, loses this the core ethnic characteristics by becoming a Christian. And for Niemöller, therefore, the Jew was just like the Black African, a member of a different Volkstum in the Völkisch sense. However, in contrast to missionary activities among Black Africans, baptism then abolished this designation for the Jew. So in a sense, the racist logic still applied, but then miraculously, for the Jews at least, the baptized Jews, it didn't. In the published essay, that's the argument from the letter, in the published essay, he qualified the recognition of converted Jews as fully authorized members of the Christian community by adding whether we like it or not. And then he essentially went on to say that the German people had to bear heavily under the influence of the Jewish people, thus then expressing a resentment against Jews. For Niemöller, the Germans were 6 weeks or so after he had signed this pledge, the victims of undue influence of the Jewish people living among them in the form of the Jewish minority. This essay from November 1933 is by no means the only evidence of the persistence of a social-cultural anti-Semitism in his thinking at this time. The biology professor Elizabeth Ziemann, a member of the Dahlem parish, she had appealed to Niemöller in letters since July to take a clear stand against the state persecution of the Jewish minority. So not against the Aryan paragraph in the church and its application in the church, but rather against decrees and laws such as the April law, which removed Jews from the civil service, and against the violent activities of the stormtroopers and others. Niemöller responded in September 1933 and rejected her request out of hand. He took the view that the church, I quote, he has nothing else to demand of the state except that it does not create any obstacle to preaching and lets the church be the church, end of quote. Pretty much entirely formulated in the spirit of the Lutheran doctrine of the two kingdoms, which separates the regiment of the state from the regiment of the church. And his conclusion was, the church does not preach to the state in its justly or unjustly applied violence, nor in regard to the Jewish question, but speaks to the people in the congregation of God's will, etc., etc. And he also, again then, reiterated in his letter to Ziemann that she should agree that as a Christian, I do not think differently from you, I quote here again, when I affirm the relative right of our people, i.e. the German people, which he then implicitly already distances and differentiates from the German Jews, who are obviously living a part of the German people, to defend themselves emphatically against excessive and harmful influence of the Jews, which in my opinion has existed. In the letter to Gottfried Holz, which I have already quoted, he then also made clear that he essentially gave the Nazi state a carte blanche to persecute the Jewish majority, and which again demonstrates also this thinking in separate categories. So if the quote, you can read the quote, if the state were to impose such a law, which is removing ministers of Jewish descent from the ministry, then I would have to bear it. End of quote. So I've provided quite a bit of detail on these developments to make the point very clear. In the early 20s, Niemöller was a supporter of folkish racial antisemitism. By 1933, he did not longer openly advocate racial antisemitism. Otherwise, he would have joined the German Christians, which he was actually invited to do. Nevertheless, he shared many core elements of their ideology and made this agreement clear on a number of occasions in public statements in the Dahlem parish in 1933. Like the German Christians, he resented the work of the socialists and communists, especially the socialist and communist freethinker movement, because it apparently undermined the Christian foundation of the German nation. He welcomed the Nazi seizure of power from the pulpit and embraced the Nazi notion of a people's community. He advocated the establishment of a unified Reich Church, and he shared the anti-Semitic resentment of the German Christians, if not fully or any longer fully based on an understanding of the Jews as a race with unchangeable, allegedly biological characteristics. So his disagreement was actually limited to 2 points. He did not accept state interference into church matters, and he refused to accept the removal of pastors of Jewish descent from the ministry. At any rate, this point that had prompted Niemöller and his friends to organize themselves in opposition against the German Christians receded into the background in the subsequent struggle over control of the Protestant Church in Prussia and in the other German states at the time. The Aryan paragraph that prompted the founding of the Pastor Emergency League in autumn 1933 was not a topic at all at the Barmen Synod in May 1934, which led to the founding of the Confessing Church, nor at most of the other synods that the Confessing Church then held in the following years at the national level or in the context of the Prussian Church. And when the issue was actually debated, it only led to confusion and to a resurfacing of anti-Jewish arguments and stereotypes. Only once did the Confessing Church find the courage to condemn the totalitarian character of the Nazi regime with a unified voice, which happened after the formal split of the Confessing Church in 1936. This split came about, in brief, because the so-called Dahlemite wing of the Confessing Church, so Niemöller and his core group of supporters, rejected any form of compromise and negotiation with the German Christians, whereas other Lutheran and Reformed Protestants were ready to compromise and to build bridges to the German Christians and seek out some form of compromise with them. So the Dahlemite wing was then represented by the so-called Second Provisional Church leadership, and they wrote a memorandum to Hitler, which was delivered on 4th of June 1936. And due to an indiscretion, there was a leak was published in a Swiss newspaper. And in this memorandum, the Confessing Church opposed the anti-Semitism imposed by Nazi ideology and opposed it and juxtaposed it with the Christian commandment to love one's neighbor. And it also raised other concerns about the totalitarian nature of the Nazi regime, pointed out the injustice of the concentration camps and a few other points. However, Niemöller only got to work on this text in the 6th final version of the memorandum, toned it down, and then actually reversed the critical intention by introducing at the beginning an anti-Bolshevik statement which corresponded to his own thinking since the 1920s. At this point, Niemöller was the figurehead of the Dahlemite wing of the Confessing Church because support for this more radical, in church political terms, stance dwindled. He radicalized his rhetoric, repeatedly directly attacking Joseph Goebbels and also the Nazi Minister for Church Affairs, Hans Kell, which led to his arrest in July 1937 and a trial at a special court. The verdict, delivered on 2nd of March 1938, was effectively an acquittal, but Hitler had already ordered in the days before the verdict that Niemöller should be brought to Sachsenhausen concentration camp, where he was detained in solitary confinement. And in 1941, he was then transferred to Dachau concentration camp, where he was kept with a group of other high-profile detainees, initially here at this end of the so-called It's the so-called bunker, which is a prison within the concentration camp for specific high-profile individuals, where he shared a number of cells with 3 Catholic priests before many of these high-profile detainees were brought to the Alps in April 1945, where they were liberated by US Army forces on 4th of May 1945. So after, against all this backdrop, sort of, which obviously wasn't of anti-Semitic statements and sentiments, after 7 years of detention in concentration camps, then Niemöller emerged in 1945 as the hero, really internationally renowned and acknowledged hero of Protestant opposition to the Nazi regime. So the Niemöller legend, as I would like to call it, emerged. And like the quotation that I quoted, it's premised on the notion of change. So Niemöller used the quote to demonstrate the extent to which he had changed in concentration camp detention, how he had overcome, especially in discussions with communist detainees, his resentment against communism. The point is that he had never any discussions with any communist detainees, neither in Sachsenhausen nor in Dachau. So you can see that was essentially not a reliable statement. The notion of change also underpinned Niemöller's engagement with German guilt in the post-war period. In August 1945, the Protestant churches established a federation as an umbrella body, the so-called EKD, headed by the Bishop of Württemberg, here seen with Niemöller, Theophilus Wurm. Niemöller became as deputy in charge of foreign affairs, essentially tasked with rebuilding ecumenical contacts. And in its Stuttgart Declaration of Guilt from October 1945, co-authored by Niemöller, the EKD admitted its moral failure and also implicit complicity in the crimes of the National Socialist regime, if, though only in very lofty, imprecise terms. Niemöller then became the foremost public advocate of the Stuttgart Declaration, both within Germany and abroad. In many speeches, sermons, and interviews, he drove home the message that the Germans had to acknowledge their guilt. And he never failed to emphasize the deeply personal dimension of his advocacy of German guilt, saying that even he, who had been detained for 8 long years, had to reckon with his own guilt. Whenever Niemöller spoke, mostly from the autumn of 1945 to 1947, about German guilt, he always mentioned that he did so because he had changed. The question is, though, had he actually really changed? And to clarify this, I will scrutinize some of his public and private statements in the immediate post-war years. In March 1946, Niemöller took part in a discussion with Swiss Protestants who had set up a relief agency for members of the confessing church. They had actually provided also material help for his 7 kids during the Second World War. And in this meeting, he stated, and I quote, I provide air quotes if that's okay, that a new anti-Semitism had arisen in Germany. And what was the reason? In his view, I quote again, as a result of the Americans having the denazification carried out by Jews. End of the quote. Which is nothing other than the anti-Semitic trope of victim reversal, according to which the Jews are the cause of the resentment directed against them. From December 46 to May 47, Niemöller was on an extended journey through actually most parts of the US to shore up relief efforts for the Germans. Numerous rabbis here protested against his public appearances, arguing that he had never clearly distanced himself from his sympathies for the Nazi regime. Especially his assertion at a press conference that anti-Semitism in Germany was dead, quote, was met with objection. In view not least of attacks against Jewish displaced persons, a Jewish journalist commented on this claim with a dry reply that Niemöller would recognize on closer inspection, and I quote here, that it is the Jews who are dead, end of quote. Niemöller was outraged by the critical attitude of representatives of the Jewish community. And he wrote lengthy manuscripts upon his return to Germany, in which he sort of, summarized his impressions of the US and his encounters. And here he agreed with those Germans who accused the Americans of, I quote, deliberate mass murder of the Germans after 1945. And he claimed out of thin air, I quote again, more German people have disappeared and perished since the end of the war than during the Nazi era. As on many other occasions, he saw the Germans, not the Jews, as the actual victims. He also expressed his anti-Semitic resentment in public. At a press conference in Berlin in June 1947, he contradicted the point that he had made earlier in the US and now claimed that anti-Semitic attitudes were indeed re-emerging in Germany. And the reason he gave was, I quote, there are Jews everywhere in the American agencies, end of quote. And also, invoking a classic anti-Semitic stereotype, he described the Jewish employees of the US military government as representatives of an aggressive policy of hate and revenge. The question is here why the German media did not really, pick up on this point and addressed Niemöller's obvious anti-Semitism, but it only took one more statement by him to finally focus the media's attention. And this came when, in June 1947, he turned up at the district office in Büdingen-Hesse, that's a region in the center of Germany where he lived at the time, in the castle of a high-ranking aristocrat. So he was always fond of members of the aristocracy. His second wife was a member of the German aristocracy. He met her in a hotel in New York in 1968. And there, in Büdingen-Hesse, a local official had refused to hand out additional ration cards for those who were had been persecuted by the Nazi regime, to his housekeeper. So the housekeeper went there. The official said, a left-leaning official said, you are not your boss. And the guys he's dealing with, former Nazis, they are have not been persecuted. Then he went there himself to the official and confronted him. That's code. I can decode the code. He didn't confront him. He yelled at him, which he often did. And I quote, I suppose you only support friends of the Jews. Sie unterstützen wohl nur Judenfreunde was the German expression. Then the Spiegel magazine covered this incident, and then a press controversy erupted that brought his anti-Semitic attitudes to the attention of a general public. The quote wasn't denied by Niemöller. On the contrary, an association of persecutees of the Nazi regime, they took this as an opportunity to deny him membership. Then he responded with a claim that those who took this decision only followed the principle, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And actually doubled down and said he could prove that only friends of the Jews would benefit from these ration cards. The press across Germany, also in Great Britain, also the American media covered this affair, concluding indeed that Niemöller could not be considered a victim of the Nazi regime. Anyone reading these reports and the extensive coverage could not hardly escape the impression that Niemöller was a habitual anti-Semite who responded to public criticism with increasing regularity by doubling down again then with even more anti-Jewish stereotypes. Against this backdrop, it seems more than just a coincidence that at the same time, in the fall of 1947, Niemöller ceased his efforts to persuade Germans to recognize their guilt for the crimes of National Socialism, which he had done pretty much, tirelessly and without a pause for almost 2 years. He must have realized that the role of a preacher of repentance was not well suited to someone whose outbursts were widely documented in the mass media. There is an additional question here, which is whether his expressions of guilt, as he had stated publicly, and his engagement for this question was actually based on sincere commitment. That's a different question, which is hard to answer, but when you can read this letter that he wrote to US Army Colonel Hugh Davis in July 1945, so that's round about 2 months before the EKD decided to write up the Stuttgart Declaration of Guilt, which one aspect of which was to facilitate contacts with ecumenical partners in other European churches, particularly in the United Kingdom, also in the Netherlands and in the Scandinavian countries, also then obviously among US Protestants. And these ecumenical contacts had always sort of one side issue that was relevant, which was to channel relief efforts, food parcels essentially, into Germany. As you can see from this letter, at this point, 2 months earlier, the question of guilt did not even occur to Niemöller. Rather, he blamed the Americans, as he did subsequently in public, continued to do so, for all the plight of the German people with, I mean, highly dubious and exaggerated remarks, as at the beginning. There weren't 20 Protestant pastors who committed suicide shortly after the war in Berlin. We have detailed case studies that would refute any such statement. What role did the Nazi genocide against the European Jews play in his speeches on these questions? First, to say that Niemöller deliberately rejected some of the rhetorical tropes that other leading Protestants used at the time to downplay the significance, the complicity of the church in the crimes of the Nazi regime. He never sought to justify his own behavior by pointing to Nazi repression against the church, and he always emphasized that he could not reject responsibility for his own guilt, and stressed the failure also of the confessing church, which had not opposed the Nazi regime, and an example that he often used, the mass imprisonment of communists. But how did he address the mass murder of the European Jews? The first point to note is that he often referenced them as victims only in passing, as in a speech in Zurich in 1946, where he mentioned them in a single sentence alongside the communists. And very often it remained entirely unclear who he actually meant when he talked about Jews. In a speech to students in January 1946, he spoke about meeting a Jew who had lost everything, as he proclaimed. According to Niemöller, he had said to them on this occasion, "Dear brother, man and Jew, I confess my guilt and ask you, forgive me and my people this guilt." But then when we probe into this and ask who was this person actually, who he encountered there, we have to read, I have read all these speeches, and another one, he then declared, it's essentially the same encounter is rendered there, and he said then this was a Jewish Christian from his own Dahlem congregation. So this was a baptized Jew who surely was a victim of Nazi racial policy, but not a Jewish German. I could add other examples that make it very clear that the members, Jewish culture and also the members, the whole notion of the Jewish religious community remained an abstract chimera for Niemöller, and that continued to be the case into the post-war period. But the key problem really was situated elsewhere. It's the entirely marginal role that the Holocaust had in all these speeches that he delivered. In the Zurich lecture, he devoted a whole one single sentence to this issue, where his description of the plight of the Germans in the post-war period was much more detailed. He talked about those who had lost their properties, the expellees, food shortages, the Germans were in the process of starving, etc., etc. He was able to speak with great empathy and vividness about the suffering of the Germans in the post-war period. But this empathy was reserved mostly for the Germans as victims of bombing, expulsion, and, in his view, always exaggerated claims that had no basis in reality as victims of Allied occupation. In the immediate post-war years, he was unable and unwilling to place the plight of the murdered Jews at the center of German guilt. He referenced the suffering of the Jews under the Nazi regime, yet he portrayed the Germans as the real victims. For context here, I should add that Niemöller was, in doing this, very much situated in the mainstream of Protestant responses to the Holocaust in the immediate post-war years. The Stuttgart Declaration of Guilt, which is a very short document anyway, it's pretty much less than a page in print, did not mention the persecution of the Jews and the Holocaust at all. The EKD Council tried in early 1946 to draft a statement on the murder of the Jews, but this came to naught. And it was left to the initiative of an immigrant, Dr. Adolf Freudenberg, a close friend of Niemöller, who had emigrated to Switzerland and worked with the emerging World Council of Churches, the body of the ecumenical work, who urged the Chancellery of the EKD to develop a public stance on these issues. The EKD Chancellor responded by tasking a jurist, Otto von Harling, with liaising, sort of bringing together a body of experts who could discuss these issues. And in October 1947, Harling gathered a group of theologians in the town of Assenheim to prepare a statement. Yet most of these experts on the so-called Jewish question, which is in itself, I mean, an anti-Semitic term anyway, were either affiliated or associated with bodies for the mission to the Jews. Hence the 9-point Assenheim Declaration, which they then, presented, essentially focused on issues on the mission among the Jews, and only the 9th final point then asked parish priests to convey that anti-Semitism is, I quote, an unchristian aberration. And again, even this declaration didn't mention the Holocaust at all. One more example. In 1947, the Council of Brethren, which is the institutional remnant at this point of the Confessing Church, Council of Brethren was the term that the Confessing Church used sort of when the pastors in the Confessing Church came together, debated again to issue a word, a public statement to the parish communities. The EKD, however, remained skeptical about such an endeavor, and Theophil Wurm, the Bishop of Württemberg, articulated the reasons for his reservations in a letter to the Council of Brethren. He had seen a draft of the statement, but there he missed, and I quote here, a consideration of concrete historical facts that continue to have an effect to the present. And then he explained what he meant by that, and I quote again, such a word on these issues had also to mention, I quote here, mention how Jewish authors have sinned against the German people by mocking the holy since the days of Heinrich Heine, and how the peasantry had suffered in some regions under the impact of Jewish usury. Heinrich Heine is the most famous and the most beloved Romanticist author in the German language. He actually used, when he talked about Jewish authors, he didn't use the term authors, he used the term jüdisches Literatentum, which already indicates that he thought that whatever Jewish authors write is not proper highbrow literature. Formulated in plain terms, Wurm was at this point, 2 years after the war, only ready to endorse a statement when it would also, on these issues and on German Protestants and the Jews after the Holocaust, when it included some of the most obstinate and really base anti-Semitic stereotypes. And it took the EKD until 1950 when it finally issued an authoritative word on the Jewish question, which not only warned against offsetting German guilt with that things that others had allegedly perpetrated against the Germans, but then also confessed that the German Christians, not in inverted commas, so German Christians more generally, had been complicit in the wickedness that the Germans had committed against the Jews. At this point, I want to come back to my starting point, the Niemöller quotation. So he's expressing remorse about his lack of empathy with key groups of victims and suggests, that's what the quote does, right, that he was failed out, that he was unable to put himself in their shoes, and hence he lacked the courage to speak out on their behalf. I would say he failed to speak out because, as I tried to show in my paper, that because he either actively resented or even hated these groups, the communists because they championed the secularism of the godless freethinkers, the trade unionists, the socialist trade unionists, because they were actively involved in class struggle against their employers, which contradicted the notion of a people's community, a harmonious social vision that he held dear, even though it was the Nazi version of this people's community that he held dear. and as shown, he resented the Jews and also the Jewish faith, which is why I've taken the liberty to rephrase the so-called Niemöller quotation in a form that, in my view, more resembles, actually, has a closer resemblance to the actual attitudes and views that Niemöller held prior to 1933, from 1933 to 1945, and as I've tried to show, also in the post-war period. I conclude with 4 brief points. First of all, anti-Semitism is a key part and thread of Niemöller's life from 1918 to the 1960s. I haven't covered the 1960s, but I can expand on that. Many people say, yes, obviously Niemöller is well known for many other things that he did, particularly in the post-war period. He was a leading figure of the ecumenical movement. He was an active pacifist and one of the leading lights of international anti-nuclear pacifism from the mid-1950s until his death in 1984. He was a prominent critic of the policy of realignment with the West in the Federal Republic, and also took a critical stance in regard to many other issues in West Germany's domestic politics. And so people come to me and they say, well, but you are forgetting, right? Sort of Niemöller is about so many other things. Yes, indeed, he is. But this is the key part and thread that we need, I think, to unravel sort of what is really going on in his life and in his engagement in Protestant church politics from 1918, essentially, into the post-war period. Second, the Niemöller poem, as should be clear now, is untruthful. We can talk about semantics here. One could also say it's essentially a lie, and we can talk more about who actually created and curated this version of the poem. That's a complicated story. The point is, it masks, deliberately or not, I can leave aside for now, a much more troubling set of attitudes than just the lack of empathy. Third point, because it is essentially based on a lie, the quote, I think, should not be any longer used in Holocaust education, as I think that truthfulness and being sincere about, motives and attitudes is actually a key requisite for any serious engagement with the legacy of the Holocaust. And fourth point, final point, hopefully then there's also, that's what I'm hoping at least, there's scope to reflect on the wider use of this quote in current political discourse in the United States, in the United Kingdom. And surprisingly, that's something that I don't quite understand how this works. Whilst the quote is well known also in Germany, it's rarely ever used in German political discourse in the present. Thank you.